Welcome to part 5 of our Unit 6 Psychological Develop. Today we're going to be talking about is gender development. And again, we're going to be pretty shallow on this. We're just going to kind of give a general overview of what's going on as we kind of look at this. Now, to start off, I just want to kind of start with just some very, very basic definitions and just a simple kind of explanation of how we define them in psychology versus how they're sometimes used out in kind of like general life. So the first thing I just want to talk about a little bit is sex and gender. Now, this is really important that we know like what these have in common, where they cross over, and where they're actually different, because they become very important as we talk about these different things psychologically. So sex is the biologically influenced characteristics by which people define male and female. Sex chromosomes contain the genes that determine our biological sex. So when we look at sex, we're talking about the biological pieces that are kind of connected there. So you're either born with the XX chromosomes or the XY chromosomes. XX is female, XY is male. And that's really what's going to determine a person's sex, right? Male or female. Now, it is also important just to mention that there are people that don't fit into these kind of binaries. So even when we talk about the kind of genetic level, there are people that either have different things going on with their chromosomes or have different things that are going on with their physical bodies and their hormones or their reproductive systems naturally, just kind of from birth. So generally speaking, the vast majority of people are going to fit into the kind of male-female sex, but there is kind of a fraction of people that won't necessarily, for a variety of different reasons. But again, sex is the biological pieces, the biological characteristics. So we're talking about hormones, we're talking about genetics, we're talking about general biology and reproductive systems when we're talking about sex. Now, the other side of this is gender, right? So we've got sex and we have gender. Now, gender is actually the socially influenced characteristics by which we define boy, girl, man, woman. So for really kind of a long time, people have kind of talked about, at least in like Western societies, talked about gender and sex kind of interchangeably. And for a lot of people, it is pretty interchangeable, right? For most people, the way that you define a boy or a girl is going to be very similar to how we define, a male or female sex. But the reality is these definitions are a lot of social pieces, right? They're socially influenced. So what it means to be a man or a woman looks different depending on the society that you live in, right? So our definitions of masculinity and femininity that are determined by one's culture. A really simple example I can give for you right now, just to kind of think about these differences in gender, is if right now I asked you, in American society, what does it mean to be a man, right? How do you picture that, or what kind of person would be considered a man or an attractive man? For most people, you would probably think of someone who is like big and muscly. Maybe they're kind of like have like a beard or facial hair or something like that, right? That's kind of what we generally think of to be a man, right? They're kind of a little, not necessarily like dirty, but like rougher, right? They're not necessarily super clean as far as like being super clean cut or pampered, or like they can go out and do things that we consider manly, right? Things that are tough or whatever. Now, if we ask that same kind of question in different places, right? So that's our definition for maybe in America. If we ask that same question in different places, what's considered an attractive man might look very different. And a really simple example I can give you guys is if you think of like K-pop groups, right, in Asia. If you think about the men in those groups, right, they don't necessarily fit what America would consider like the masculinity in the U.S., right? They tend to be a lot leaner. They're not like big, muscly people. Very often completely clean shaven, right? They're very, very stylish. They oftentimes will actually dress ways that, in the U.S. we wouldn't consider being super masculine. But in that culture, and obviously we see that because so much culture crosses over between different countries now, but in that culture, right, they are very much considered very attractive men, right? And they're considered masculine the same way that we consider certain men masculine here. So, and again, this is just kind of a very small example, but just to look at how we can basically define these things differently, right? What it means to be manly or feminine changes. And we can also obviously look at this over time as well, right? What it meant to be masculine in the past definitely looks different than it does today. So sex is really referring to the biological side of things, where gender is referring to the more social side of things. Now, again, they're very much intertwined with each other, but they aren't kind of these, they aren't the same thing. And that's a really important piece as we continue on with the rest of this stuff. So that's going to get us to gender roles. And again, we'll look into kind of some of these videos of examples of different ideas about gender roles in class. But gender roles are a set of expectations or expected behaviors, attitudes, and traits for males and females. So if we're going to talk about gender roles, it's really looking at, when we have males, how do we expect them to act? What kind of attitude do we expect them to have? What kind of traits do we expect them to have? And then we do the same thing for females. When we look at females, how do we expect them to act? What kind of attitudes do we expect them to have? What kind of traits do we expect them to have? All of these things would be in these gender roles. Now, again, earlier before, if you were thinking about, and I asked, what does it mean to be masculine or manly in the United States? A lot of the things you probably thought of were different gender roles, right? You probably thought of behaviors that this person should have. You thought of attitudes this person should have. You thought of physical traits that this person should have. All of those are defined by this gender roles. Now, again, obviously, if it's these expectations, these are very much, again, coming from society, right? We create our different ideas of what gender roles are, which is why they can look different from place to place to place. For example, right, in American culture, masculine roles have traditionally been associated with strength, aggression, and dominance, while feminine roles have traditionally been associated with passivity, nurturing, and subordination. Okay, so again, you can kind of think about these two different pieces and connect it very much to, how we see the two genders. So we expect men to be one way, we expect women to be one way, and then beyond, like from these kind of expectations, we then, society kind of pushes and pulls people into these. So we'll kind of see that in just a moment. And again, like I said, we'll see some of the ways that this actually happens in these videos as well. So we can talk a little bit about gender identity as well. I'm going to I want to move myself here. I'm going to move myself right in the middle of this. Can I go right there? Yeah, this is all right. So we'll talk about the little kind of graphic at the bottom in just a moment, but then we can get into gender identity. So gender identity is an individual's sense of being male or female or both or some sort of kind of combination, right? Now this is something that has always really been around, but it's just kind of recently become something that is a important or widespread or common topic in society, at least in American society. But it's this idea of not just necessarily, you have a biological sex that you're born with, you have a gender that you're kind of given as you grow up or expectations that you're kind of held to, but then you also have a gender identity, which is really more about you and where you feel like you fit. Now, again, gender identities can kind of be a little harder to nail down, I would say, than when we talk about sex or when we talk about even gender or gender roles, because, again, it's focusing on an individual. So for some people, our gender identity is going to be the same as our sex that we've been assigned at birth. For some of us, it's going to be different. Now, again, you might notice like where it says sex assigned. For some people, sex is very much assigned, right? At birth, some people, again, are not necessarily just male or just female or a combination in the middle or neither. So a sex may actually be assigned to some people. For most of us, there's going to be biological things that are going to determine that, but for some it's not. So there is a little bit of kind of gray area there that oftentimes we don't address. Now, one of the things that's important is when you think about these different gender roles specifically, one thing that can be really tricky is that for some of us, the roles that we have in place in our society don't necessarily match who we are as an individual. Right, and this is why gender identity can be different, right? This is where we can have someone have a certain sex but have a different gender identity. And I think a really simple way to think about it is if you are biologically a male, but you don't have necessarily the traditional masculine traits that a lot of people consider to be what makes you a male, there might be a lot of things about you that are a lot more closely connected with being a female, right? Or a lot more closely connected with being feminine. So this idea of identity is, okay, what is your sense of where you are, right? So those of us who identify with a role that is different from our biological sex are often referred to as transgender, right? And there's obviously a lot of other different pieces, but this is kind of the deepest that we're going to delve into it. So there's like this little image at the bottom, and again, this is not like a real psychological chart or anything like that. It's just kind of a very simple one. But I like it because of kind of the edges here. So if you have like on one end Barbie and one end G.I. Joe, these are kind of extreme versions of masculinity and femininity. Now, I will say like Barbie has very much changed over time. She's been around for a very, very long time. But I think kind of like the traditional image of Barbie is this like very pretty, very sparkly, very much focused on dresses. And if you like even look at like early Barbie like accessories and things, it was focused on things that were considered feminine, right? It was taking care of the house, or it was dresses and makeup, or caring for children, right? All of those things would be considered feminine, at least at those times, right? And on the other side, we have G.I. Joe, right? G.I. Joe is a soldier. He's big, he's tough. He is going to protect people, but he's not super overly emotional, and maybe you could say like angry, but he's very stoic, right? Now, these are kind of like our ends. And if you really think about actual human beings, right, whether it's your family members, if it's your mom, your dad, or whatever, the reality is we don't actually fit into these, right? If you're male, like there are times that you're emotional, right? There are times that you're upset. There are times that you're afraid of things. All of those things, right, are still happening to you regardless of your gender, right? And on the same thing happens on the other end. There are plenty of women who are completely uninterested in things that would be generally considered a female's role, right? A really simple example is you may not want to have children. You may not want to stay at home and care for kids or take care of a household, right? So this idea is that when we kind of talk about this possibly being more of a spectrum, or when psychology says this is more of a spectrum, really what they're saying is that there's these kind of gender ideas and roles that we've created as a society, but the reality is we don't all fit into these roles. Not all women are the same, and not all men are the same. So the reality is there's kind of more of a spectrum going on here to kind of look at. Now it gets us to gender socialization. Oh, I want to do myself again. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. So gender socialization. So how do we kind of learn about these different things, right? Obviously, biology is something that, we were born with different biological processes and genetics and all those different things. But if gender is something that's created by society, how does that happen, and why is it so perpetual, so widespread, right? Why can you go to pretty much anybody in the United States and ask them, feminine or masculine traits, and they'll give you relatively similar answers no matter where you are? Really, this comes down to what's called gender socialization. Now, we haven't gotten to a lot of the social psychology that we'll get to. That's our very last unit of the year. But you can kind of see some of this, and a lot of it will also be relatively closely connected to some of the social development we have talked about and will continue to talk about, like attachment from our last video. So gender socialization, very simply, is the process in which children learn these gender roles. So how we learn what it means to be a man, how we learn what it means to be a woman as we go through life. Again, this is something that's socialized, it's taught to us by society. Now, there are four major, what we call agents of socialization, four major things that teach us most of the stuff about society. So the four big ones are family, education, peer groups, and mass media. Those are the big things that teach us about society. Now, again, there's a ton of different things that are socialized in us, from, like I said, what it means to be a certain gender, to what it means to be cool, what it means to have a certain job, what things we should or should not do. Even a really simple example, the fact that if you're at a restaurant and you're eating spaghetti, you shouldn't eat it with your hands, right? That is something that you've been socialized into knowing, right? You've been socialized into doing, where Today, for most of you, I'd say all of you, but I'll just say most of you. You never know. For the majority of us, it's not something you even really think about, right? You just know that I should eat with silverware, that I should wipe my mouth when I do this, that I shouldn't chew with my mouth open, right? All these things are really simple, and I'm just using all like etiquette things. But all of them are things that are something that's taught to us by society. Our family teaches us it, our schools teach us it, our friends teach us different things, the media tells us things, right? And all of this is socialized into us. And the exact same thing happens with gender. Children are aware of gender roles by the age of 2 or 3. At 4 or 5, most children are firmly entrenched in culturally appropriate gender roles. So this starts incredibly early. I'll give you a very simple example of one of the ways that we actually kind of can begin to socialize gender. When you are born, right, if you are at the hospital, and I don't obviously know if they necessarily do this right now, but for a long period of time, if you were a boy, you got wrapped in a blue blanket. And if you were a girl, you got wrapped in a pink blanket. And for a lot of people, and most people actually, those colors still very much represent male and female. That right there is one way that we start socializing. Where if you go to young kids who are 4 or 5 years old and you ask them, if you go to a little boy and you say, hey, do you want this pink thing or this pink doll? They're going to say, no, that's a girl's toy. Right? And again, what that shows us is that they know what these things mean, right? They know what toys are for boys. They know what toys are for girls. They know that they are a boy or a girl, and this is what they should be using or shouldn't be using, right? Boys don't wear dresses. Girls wear dresses. And again, all these things are things that it may, some of it may come from parents, right? But not even need to happen that way, right? They see it on TV. They see their family and friends. They go to school and they see other people there. All of these things slowly kind of push these different ideas and socialize them into who we are. And what's really important about socialization is it's not necessarily something that, for most people at least, it's not necessarily something that you think of and you like have to do. It's more of something that becomes just part of who you are. For the majority of people, because the majority of people are going to identify as the same gender as their sex, and it's going to be considered culturally and socially appropriate. For most of us, it becomes part of who we are, right? For most of you, being male or female is important to your identity. It's part of you, and it'd be hard to think about, right now if you were like, okay, if you were the opposite gender, if you switched, you were the opposite sex, let's say, and that happened, and you think about, okay, would you be the same? You probably are like, oh, there would be things that would be different about me, right? There'd be traits that I would or wouldn't have, or I'd do things differently or whatever. All of that is this kind of idea that it becomes part of who you are. Socialization becomes part of your own identity, as well as how society sees you. So we see all these different pieces. We're going to look at a really cool example in this video here, where they took, this is actually a little boy and a little girl. I think they're like maybe like 1 to 2 years old, somewhere in there. I think about 1 year old. They're pretty young. And they basically dress them opposite, right? If you've ever been around very young infants, it's really hard to tell the difference between a boy and a girl. They all pretty much look the same. So what they do is they basically swap their outfits. So they dress the boy like a girl and they dress the girl like a boy, and they give him a fake name. And then they have strangers basically come in and play with the kids. And they just see, okay, how do they interact? And what they notice is that when they do this, they actually treat the kids differently. That if they believe that it's a boy, they'll give them different toys, they'll handle them differently, they'll talk to them differently. If they think it's a girl, they'll see different things, different toys, different way that they interact, different way that they talk, different way that they handle them. And again, all of these things, all of these kind of small little tiny pieces build and build and build and build, and it tells us, okay, this is how boys should be and this is how girls should be by the time we're about 4 or 5 years old. We also have what is called the social learning theory. So the social learning theory comes from Albert Bandura. We've already actually talked a little bit about the social learning theory when we talked about the Bobo doll, which is where we watch people do something and then we imitate it. That's the exact same thing. So we're basically taking this idea of observing a behavior and then imitating the behavior and attaching that not just to physical things that we do, but also gender, right? Again, gender comes with a lot of behaviors. It comes with a lot of traits. So this idea that children look to their family members, they look to their parents, they look to people at school to see, how should I act? And I watch other people and I notice what are the things that they get rewarded for, what are the things they get punished for, and then I follow those, right? This idea of monkey see, monkey do. We're gonna watch another clip of this is actually an advertisement or a little trailer for a movie that was created. I think it's on Netflix if I remember correctly, but it looks at kind of young boys and young men, and talks about how this social learning theory kind of can be unhealthy in a lot of cases because of the focus on masculinity, especially in certain cultures and certain parts of the U.S. And it pushes them to be a certain way, act a certain way, even when it's not necessarily the thing that is the most healthy for them, or the thing they even want to do necessarily. So we'll kind of look at that a little bit as well. Now, even with all of this, there are differences that we see when we look at men and women. So let's start with one side, and then we'll kind of go to the other. So aggression, for one, is really one of the places that we see really big differences. So aggression is one of the most consistently documented psychological gender differences. Male children are more aggressive than female children, and men are more physically aggressive, and women are more often likely to use what's called relational aggression. So even the way that they are different. So generally speaking, men are going to be more aggressive than women overall, right? And again, we're not talking about individual people. We're talking about as an entire group. So we're going to just see more aggressiveness. Now, in addition to just being more aggressive, the way that they're aggressive is going to be very different. So again, men tend to be much more physically aggressive. When they are having confrontation, they are more likely to have a physical fight, for example. Where women are much more likely to use what's called relational aggression. Relational aggression, and I believe we'll talk about this again later on as well, is like where maybe I start a rumor about somebody, right? Or maybe I talk, about behind their back or something like that. Those are relationship aggressions, right? I'm being aggressive still, but I'm not going to necessarily walk up and punch them in the face. I'm going to, do something to their relationships, the relationships they have with people. So again, just kind of differences we see in aggression, as well as how likely it is. We also see differences in anxiety. So women are more often depressed, anxious, and have 10 times greater chance of developing an eating disorder. Men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide or become alcoholics. They also are more likely to be autistic, colorblind, have ADHD, or are antisocial. So again, and all of those are, not all of those, but a few of those are connected with anxiety disorders as well, which is why it's under that same piece. But again, we kind of see differences here, right? So one of the really interesting things I think is even though women are more likely or more often depressed or anxious or are far, far, far more likely to develop an eating disorder, I think it's really interesting that we see that men, though, are the ones who are much more likely to commit suicide, right? 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And I think that's a really interesting piece, and it tells us, again, a lot about kind of different pieces and things that you can look at, right? If you were going to look at, necessarily like you could say problems that men face maybe as a gender, one of the big ones would probably be dealing with anxiety, dealing with depression, dealing with failure, things like that, because again, they don't necessarily fit traditional gender roles that men have. And so we can kind of start to look at these pieces, and ideally, we want to acknowledge these kind of differences that we do see between men and women and say, okay, well then how do we deal with that, right? How do we deal with the fact that women are so much more likely to, say, have an eating disorder? What do we do? Right? Why do we see that even though they're not as likely to be depressed, or at least we don't know that they're depressed, men are so much more likely to commit suicide, right? Why is that happening? How do we deal with that? So all these pieces are really important from a psychological perspective of just looking at and then ideally finding ways to start fixing or at least understanding these problems a little bit more. So let's look at a few more differences between men and women. So we also see differences. Oh, I wanted to move out of the way here. I fit right here, perfect. So more differences between men and women. So academic ability. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit when we talked about intelligence, but boys tend to outperform girls in math and spatial tasks. We saw that they also tend to score better in these places on IQ tests, which obviously they're going to be relatively similar. Academic scores versus IQ tests are going to be correlated at least. We also see that girls tend to outperform boys in language arts, which again connects to things that we saw earlier on the IQ scores. And females also read earlier than males. We also see differences in kind of how they orient what they're doing. So men tend to be more accomplishment oriented and women tend to be more relationship oriented. So again, these are overall pieces, but overall we're going to see where men are very more likely to be focused on doing specific things, right? Winning an award, getting a certain position, getting a certain job, right? Completing tasks. Where women tend to be more relationship focused. We're more likely to see them focused on not that they're not going to also care about getting things done and achieving things, but there's more of a focus on things going well, on interactions with people, on groups being effective and working together and getting along, and all those kind of pieces as well. We do also see that men tend to spend much more time alone, where women will spend much more time with others. And again, these are all pieces now. One of the really big questions with kind of all the stuff that we look at in these differences, whether it's these last pieces, which are a little more focused on younger children or people in school age, as well as, aggression and anxiety, a lot of these questions come down to, okay, where does all these pieces happen, right? Where do they come from? Are there biological reasons that we see differences, especially in, aggression or in anxiety? Is there social reasons, right, that are pushing us one way or the other? Or is it a combination of both, right? Are there biological factors that kind of maybe would cause something like aggression or something like anxiety? And then on top of that, are there social factors that are also going to, push one way or the other? So there's kind of a whole bunch of gray space in these pieces, but just kind of understanding. Now, the reason this is right here is a lot of, as we mentioned before, a lot of this gender socialization and how this functions for us is happening immediately, right? From the day we are born, this socialization starts to happen. And by the time, like we said, by 4 or 5, they're generally pretty entrenched. For most people, by the time we get through, elementary school and into middle school and high school and move on, right? These things are very much part of us. And we are kind of dealing with the challenges or the consequences that we have with them, as well as, maybe the positive aspects as well of, how we define ourselves and how other people define us as well. So that'll kind of wrap up this kind of very quick conversation on gender and these different pieces that we're seeing. Make sure you do a short summary. Again, really focusing in on kind of the specific parts that we want to look at for psychology. And then I'll see you guys next time.